Good afternoon, everyone. One of the works we'll be discussing this week is John Edgar Wideman's Fever. Fever is the title story to a collection of stories that Wideman wrote that were published in 1989. And I want to give you some background on Wideman himself, the story Fever, and also the history upon which Fever is based. Wideman is a renowned and award winning American fiction writer. He was born in 1941 and he grew up in Pittsburgh. He then attended the University of Pennsylvania, which is in Philadelphia, before becoming a Rhodes Scholar and then attending the University of Iowa, which has a renowned creative writing program. Uh, Wideman has taught at the University of Pennsylvania, among other schools, where he founded its African American Studies department. And his research into Philadelphia history provided the impetus for his story Fever. So, the galvanizing event in Fever is the outbreak of the yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia in 1793. As some background, yellow fever is a hemorrhagic fever from the same family as Zika, dengue, and West Nile virus. What we know now is that it is spread by infected mosquitoes. It actually wasn't known in 1793. And the fever initially causes fever and flu like symptoms, from which actually most people tend to recover. At least they recover now from that. However, in about 15% to 20% of cases, people go on to develop an acute infection. And in this acute phase, yellow fever can cause an inflammation of the liver, leading to liver damage, which produces jaundice or yellowed skin, which is one of its hallmarks. In addition, in this acute phase, people can experience internal bleeding, vomiting blood, shock, and multi organ failure. Now, in 1793, Philadelphia experienced its first outbreak of yellow fever. It began in late July and it lasted until late November. Like other epidemics that we've read about, the outbreak of yellow fever in Philadelphia caused widespread panic, bringing basically commerce and basic city functions almost to a halt. People who could afford to, and that was mainly white residents, ended up fleeing, while poorer residents stayed behind. So that included both immigrant residents and also African American residents. Now, unlike other epidemics, this particular epidemic is a bit unique. First, Philadelphia in 1793 was the capital of the US. It also was a major port city, so it brought together or became a hub for both international and national trade. Um, and the US at this point in history was a slaveholding country. And Philadelphia happened to have a large population of free African Americans. However, racism and racial distrust also abounded, both generally in the US and also in Philadelphia. And the outbreak of yellow fever is then inflected by racial and medical tensions. In terms of its medical tensions, doctors in the 1790s really didn't know what caused yellow fever. They wouldn't know this until about the early 20th century. So they didn't really understand that mosquitoes were a vector for the disease, although they did know that the disease tended to have some geographic, tended to be geographically located in certain areas, and they also knew that it was very contagious. And in the 1790s, there were two competing etiological theories of how the disease had risen. The first is a theory about miasma, and the second is a theory about importation. So the miasmic theory held that the fever was caused by effluvia, or sort of bad or dirtied air, that was resulting from stagnant water and generally from sort of filth and garbage in the city. And the importation theory held that the fever was caused by refugees fleeing the slave revolution in Haiti. In particular, it was thought that it was caused by the black slaves that the French Haitian refugees were bringing with them. Now, from that importation theory, that ended up actually devolving. So that what happened is that white residents began to draw a connection between not just this particular group of slave refugees, but actually all African American people in Philadelphia. They began to think that all African American people were carriers of this of yellow fever. However, that theory did not actually hold as time went on. So, after the initial outbreak of yellow fever, white citizens began to shun black citizens because they thought that they were the cause of the disease. However, as the epidemic spread, what happened is that white people began to abandon the city in large numbers, um, in actually much higher numbers than African Americans. And there became a severe labor shortage, in particular, a shortage of people that were available to care for the dying and the dead. So at that time, civic leaders in Philadelphia began to claim that African Americans were not the source of the disease, but in fact were immune from it. And they began to encourage African Americans to care for those white people that were stricken by the infection. And from what we know, African Americans did. They turned out in large numbers, largely organized by Absalom Jones and Richard Allen, who were prominent members of the African American Philadelphia community. Um, these community members served in large numbers as grave diggers, as carters of the dead and of the dying, back and forth to hospitals and also grave sites, as nurses. And then there was a number of them that were trained by Dr. Benjamin Rush, who was a prominent physician in Philadelphia who studied the disease and came up with a form of treatment that involved purging and bloodletting. So he trained a number of African Americans who served as his apprentices and also kind of in the role of doctors. Now, the hope of African Americans, in particular Jones and Allen, was that by serving the public, African Americans would finally be accepted within Philadelphian culture as sort of fully enfranchised American citizens. However, once the epidemic was over, Philadelphians began to turn on their African American caretakers, accusing them of negligence and also of abuses. And in particular, Matthew Carey printed a blistering attack on African American caretakers. And we see reference to Matthew Carey in the opening epigraphs. What Carey was doing in his attack effectively was rewriting the history of what occurred during the yellow fever epidemic in a way that misrepresented the heroism of Black citizens. So, what he did was he basically once again portrayed them as perpetrators of the disease. And in so doing, he also kind of doubly victimized them because they began to be thought of as, as being carriers of the disease. Then, when they were needed, they were asked to serve as caretakers for other people with that disease. They went forward and they served faithfully as caretakers and as members of the community, putting themselves at risk. And then again, they were blamed. Now, Carey's writing actually prompted a response from Jones and Allen. It was called The Narrative of the Proceedings of Black People. And that response forms the imaginative core of Wideman's story. So, Wideman's story, in essence, uses the 1793 outbreak as both an event and also as a metaphor for thinking about the persistence of racism. One of the things he does is he calls attention to the fact that African Americans were left behind during the epidemic. As the poorer residents of the city, they didn't have the economic means to flee, and when they got sick, they didn't have the economic means to hire doctors or nurses. Moreover, because members of their own community were busy serving white people, those African Americans that were infected ended up dying in droves. Um, and in so doing, Wideman also calls attention to the distrust and exploitation of Black Philadelphians by white Philadelphians, even as these Black Philadelphians are ironically serving as the faithful and assiduous caretakers of their white neighbors. And by doing this, he reveals that racial distrust on the part of white Philadelphians and white people in general prevents them from recognizing their common humanity with their African American neighbors. In other words, he shows, and he does this in a variety of ways, that beneath all external bodily appearances, all human beings have the same anatomy and thus the same vulnerabilities to disease. Now, this is a difficult and a complex text, and I have to say that it definitely took me a long time to read it. So I imagine that you might have also found it somewhat complicated. One of the things that complicates this text is that there's multiple narrators. So the story actually begins with what we presume to be the author himself, um, and then it moves from there to the voice of an unnamed African American slave who's sitting in a slave ship. But there's also other unnamed voices that chime in, everything from various caretakers to various victims of yellow fever, including at the beginning the prophetic voice of an elderly African American person who diagnoses the disease as being caused by the institution of slavery and the racism that underpins this institution. The voice that we hear from most prominently, though, is actually the voice of Alan, as he cares for the dead and dying. In addition to these voices, though, Wiedemann has also woven other sources of information. So we have voices from people who are acting as witnesses, but we also have accounts from that proceedings. We have accounts of autopsies as bodies are being dissected and measured, and then we have accounts from modern day medical books explaining what yellow fever is. In addition to all of these different sources, though, Weidman is also moving back and forth in time. So, again, we begin the story with the narrator in the first passage in what is supposed to be sort of modern times as he's looking out the window from his study and trying to figure out how he can tell this history. From there, we actually move back in time. We hear this cacophony of voices of people experiencing the outbreak. And then the work ends by going back and forth in time. So it moves first the voice of a modern day worker at a nursing home who feels obviously disengaged from his labor. The narrator then discusses a fire that took place in the 1980s in which several Black people were killed. And it finally ends with the autopsy of the narrator who has helped all of these white residents. So, in our discussion today, what I would like us to think about is how and why the author crafts his story to connect yellow fever to race relations. All right, I look forward to discussing this text with you, and I'll see you on the discussion board.